At 4:38 on a Monday morning, the motion alarm on my lower pasture camera woke me up. I expected a deer. Instead, I watched part of the mountain move. The image shook once, blurred, then came back into focus. A dark line had opened across the wet hillside below my house. It stretched through the exact strip where 23 mature willow trees had stood 10 days earlier. Rain had been falling for almost 36 hours. Not a hurricane, not some once-in-a-century storm, just relentless mountain rain that had saturated every layer of soil beneath the slope. I pulled on boots, grabbed my phone, and ran outside. Water was coming out of the hillside in places where I had never seen springs before. The old willow stumps were surrounded by dark mud, and several had tilted downhill. Then I heard the sound, not an explosion, more like a deep tearing noise followed by the grinding of rock, roots, and saturated earth. A section of slope roughly 180 feet wide detached. Trees leaned, soil folded, and mud accelerated downhill. Below my property sat Summit Ridge Preserve, one of the most expensive gated developments in that part of western North Carolina. And directly in the path of the slide was a new vacation villa belonging to HOA president Vanessa Cole. 10 days earlier, Vanessa had finally gotten the mountain view she wanted. That morning, the mountain came through her retaining wall. Nobody was inside. The villa had not yet received full-time occupancy because finish work was still underway. That fact probably prevented a tragedy, but the property itself was hit hard. Mud crossed the rear terrace, filled the lower patio, smashed through part of the pool equipment room, buried landscaping, bent a section of the garage wall, and pushed debris against the back of the living area. The new infinity terrace disappeared under brown soil. A section of retaining wall folded forward, and the glass wall that had been designed to frame the mountains now faced a pile of mud and uprooted roots. By daylight, county emergency management had blocked the private access lane below the slope. A geotechnical team arrived before noon, then the insurer, then the HOA attorney. Vanessa told people the storm had caused an unforeseeable landslide. I understood why she wanted that explanation. Because 11 days earlier, I had sent her a stamped geotechnical report warning that removing the willow row could materially increase shallow slope instability during prolonged rainfall. The contractor had received the same report. So had the property manager. So had the HOA attorney. The contractor had then asked the board to confirm, in writing, that it still wanted the trees removed, despite the engineering objection. Vanessa authorized the work. The trees came down. 10 days later, the hillside failed. I did not celebrate. I stood behind the county tape, looking at a villa half buried in soil, and felt sick. I had spent weeks trying to prevent exactly that scene. The willows had never been decorative to me. Their roots occupied the wet toe of a steep slope that had carried groundwater long before Summit Ridge existed. My father had protected those trees. My grandfather had protected them. Vanessa saw them differently. From her new villa, they blocked part of the western mountain view. She believed an old vegetation easement gave the HOA the right to remove them. She believed I was using environmental concerns to obstruct a community rule. She believed the trees could be cut first, and any disagreement handled later. The county investigators eventually found something even more damaging than my warning. Buried in the original subdivision engineering file was a slope note that Summit Ridge had apparently forgotten. Existing vegetated slope buffer. Preserve where practicable. The villas below had been designed around the assumption that the stabilized, vegetated hillside above would remain substantially intact. Vanessa had spent months fighting for a clearer view. Now county engineers were studying whether removing the very vegetation she hated had helped send that view downhill into her house. My name is Caleb Turner. I was 56 when the slide happened. I own 14 acres above Summit Ridge Preserve. The property is steep, irregular, and worth far less on paper than the luxury homes below it. That has never bothered me. My grandparents bought the first section in 1974. My father added several neighboring acres 20 years later, and I inherited the land after he died. The house is modest. 2 bedrooms upstairs, a stone chimney, and a workshop behind the garage. Most of the value, at least to me, is outside. A spring, old hardwoods, a narrow meadow, and a slope that drops sharply toward the subdivision. The willows grew along the lower bench, where groundwater naturally collected. They were not weeping willows arranged around a landscaped pond. They were old, broad-rooted trees that had spread naturally along the damp contour. Some trunks were more than 2 feet thick. During dry summers, their leaves stayed green after grass farther uphill had browned. After heavy storms, water seeped around their roots and moved gradually toward an old drainage swale. My father watched that slope constantly. He was not an engineer. He had spent 40 years operating excavation equipment, which gave him a practical respect for wet soil. He taught me never to strip vegetation from the toe of a steep bank without understanding what was behind it. When Summit Ridge was first proposed, developers met with neighboring landowners. Their engineers surveyed drainage, mapped slope angles, and built retaining systems lower on the mountain. My father refused to sell our land, but he did agree to a limited recorded easement near the boundary. Its purpose was vegetation management, associated with certain view corridors. That document became the center of everything years later. The easement allowed reasonable access for trimming vegetation within a defined zone. It also allowed removal of trees that were dead, diseased, or determined to present a hazard. It did not say the HOA could clear an entire living tree row because a homeowner preferred an open panorama. For nearly 15 years, nobody interpreted it that way. Maintenance crews occasionally trimmed branches, and once, an arborist removed a dead maple. Nobody touched the willows. Then Vanessa Cole built her villa. Vanessa had served on the Summit Ridge board for 4 years before becoming president. Her new house sat on one of the development's highest premium lots: modern stone, dark timber, glass, and a pool terrace facing west. The marketing photographs were designed around sunset views. Unfortunately for Vanessa, my willows filled part of that view during summer. The first request seemed harmless. The HOA asked permission to thin several crowns. I agreed to limited trimming if a certified arborist performed it, and the work was done. The following summer, another letter arrived. This time the board wanted 4 trees removed, describing them as visually obstructive and increasingly unstable. I asked for the arborist report supporting the instability claim. There was none. I hired my own arborist. All 4 were alive. 1 needed deadwood removed, but none required felling. I sent the report, and the issue went quiet for several months. Then Vanessa became board president. The next notice was different. It demanded removal of the entire willow row within 30 days, under the vegetation management easement. The reason was not disease. The letter referred to restoration of the originally intended western view corridor. I pulled the deed, the recorded easement, and old subdivision documents. Then I walked the slope, after 3 days of rain. Water was moving through the willow roots, and I could push a soil probe into the lower bank with almost no resistance. That was when I stopped thinking about views and realized I needed someone qualified to look at the ground. I hired Dr. Aaron Mills, a geotechnical engineer who had worked on slope stabilization projects throughout the region. Aaron spent almost half a day on the property. He studied soil exposures, slope geometry, drainage, old grading, and vegetation. He reviewed public topographic information and original subdivision files we could obtain. His concern centered on the lower bench. The willows were not magical anchors capable of preventing every landslide. No tree system can guarantee that. But mature roots were reinforcing shallow soil, extracting moisture during the growing season, and helping maintain a vegetated surface across a wet portion of the slope. Mass removal, especially before a rainy period, would eliminate part of that reinforcement and disturb the ground. His written recommendation was cautious and clear. Avoid wholesale removal, pending detailed slope review. Use selective pruning if view maintenance was required, and if trees had to be removed. Phase the work and implement engineered drainage and stabilization measures first. That was reasonable. I sent it to Summit Ridge, thinking an engineer's letter would end the argument. Instead, Vanessa treated it as another obstacle. If you own property on a slope, near a retaining wall, below a cut bank, or above someone else's house, keep your old grading plans, drainage records, surveys, photographs, and professional reports. A tree dispute can stop being about landscaping the moment roots, water, and soil stability become part of the picture. And if you have ever seen an HOA prioritize appearance over drainage, trees, or slope safety, leave your thoughts in the comments and share this story with someone who lives in hill country. What looks like an ugly tree line from one patio may be performing a job nobody notices until it is gone. I did not want to fight with Vanessa. I wanted her to trim the view responsibly and leave the hillside intact. She decided that was not enough. The board's attorney responded to Aaron's report first. The letter did not dispute his technical observations. Instead, it focused on the easement. Summit Ridge argued that vegetation interfering with designated views could be managed within the recorded corridor. My attorney, Rachel Warren, disagreed with their interpretation. She pointed out that the document repeatedly used language about trimming, maintenance, hazard removal, and reasonable access. It did not grant unrestricted timber rights. More importantly, an easement right is generally limited by its purpose. Even if the HOA could remove some vegetation, exercising that right in a way that unreasonably damaged the servient property created a different problem. Rachel proposed a compromise: selective canopy reduction, removal of 2 smaller trees after engineering review, no disturbance of the lower bench, install drainage monitoring, and reassess after 1 season. Vanessa rejected it. Summit Ridge then hired an arborist who evaluated the trees from the HOA side. His report said several had structural defects common to older willows and that long-term replacement could be appropriate. That was not the same as saying all 23 needed to come down immediately. Still, the board used the report to support full removal. Then things accelerated. One Thursday morning, orange paint appeared on trunks. 23 marks. I photographed every one. Rachel sent a cease and desist letter that afternoon. Aaron sent a supplemental warning, noting he had checked the weather outlook and observed that the regional wet season was beginning. Removing the full row without stabilization could increase erosion, groundwater expression, and shallow instability. The contractor, Blue Ridge Tree and Land, received copies. Their foreman, Marcus Bell, did something I later respected enormously. He stopped mobilization. Then he sent the HOA a written request for clarification. The message stated that the property owner had provided a geotechnical objection and that the contractor recommended resolving the slope concern before broad removal. Marcus asked the HOA to confirm its authority and responsibility for directing the work. The next day, the property manager forwarded authorization signed by Vanessa on behalf of Summit Ridge. The language stated that the association was exercising recorded easement rights and instructed the contractor to proceed. Rachel immediately sought emergency relief, but legal timelines do not always move as fast as chainsaws. The first crew arrived at 7:20 Monday morning. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line because contractors were entering my property under a disputed easement. A deputy came, and he reviewed the documents. This was not something he could decide at the roadside. The HOA claimed easement authority, and I claimed they were exceeding it. He documented the situation and advised everyone to avoid confrontation. I did. No blocking trucks, no touching equipment, no threats. I filmed from outside the work zone. The first willow came down shortly after 8, hitting the slope with a sound I felt in my chest. By lunch, 6 were gone. Roots remained in the ground, but the canopy that had been pulling water from that bench disappeared tree by tree. Over the next 2 days, all 23 were felled. The contractor did not grind every stump, because Aaron had specifically warned that aggressive stump removal could disturb the soil further. That decision probably prevented additional damage. When the work ended, the hillside looked naked. Places that had always been shaded were suddenly exposed. The soil beneath the trees was soft and torn from machinery, and branches were gone. Sunlight reached Vanessa's terrace. For the first time, her west-facing glass wall had an uninterrupted view through the former willow row. 2 days later, Summit Ridge posted photographs of the newly opened view in its resident newsletter, celebrating completion of vegetation maintenance along the western corridor. I saved the post, not because it proved negligence, but because it proved purpose. This had not been emergency tree removal, it had been view clearance. Aaron returned to inspect the slope, finding tire disturbance and several areas of exposed soil. He recommended immediate erosion cover, temporary drainage control, and monitoring for cracks or seepage. Rachel forwarded the recommendations. Summit Ridge authorized straw matting on part of the disturbed area, but did not approve the more extensive drainage measures. According to later board records, Vanessa believed Aaron was exaggerating the risk because I had hired him, and the HOA discussed obtaining its own geotechnical review, but never completed one before the rain. 7 days after the trees came down, the forecast changed, with a slow-moving storm system expected to deliver several inches of rain. Aaron emailed everyone again, recommending temporary runoff diversion above the cleared area and daily monitoring of the slope. I installed temporary controls only on portions entirely outside the easement work zone, after confirming with Aaron that I would not redirect water toward neighboring property. Summit Ridge did nothing substantial on its side. On day 9, rain began. By that evening, the old willow bench was saturated. By day 10, the ground started moving. Once the hillside failed, everybody wanted records. County emergency management, building safety, the HOA insurer, Vanessa's homeowner carrier, the contractor's insurer, and engineers representing nearly every party. Rachel told me to preserve everything exactly as it existed: original emails, photographs with metadata, camera footage, Aaron's reports, weather data, the sheriff incident number, the HOA newsletter, and even text messages with neighbors. The slide zone was fenced off, and nobody was allowed to begin full cleanup until investigators documented conditions. The county geotechnical consultant, Dr. Melissa Grant, walked the failure area with a survey crew. She did not begin with the trees, she began with the mountain. That mattered. Slope failures are rarely explained by one dramatic fact. They looked at soil type, slope angle, groundwater, rainfall, existing drainage, construction below, retaining structures, vegetation removal, surface disturbance, and the geometry of the failure plane. Rainfall had clearly been the immediate trigger, as the soil had become saturated. But that did not answer why this particular section released where and when it did. The upper scarp crossed the recently cleared zone. Shallow roots had been severed where machines traveled. Several stump plates showed movement, and water was emerging through exposed soil. The slide track followed the lower bench before accelerating toward Vanessa's villa. Then the county pulled the old development file, and that was where the story changed. The original geotechnical report for Summit Ridge had identified the western slope as an area requiring careful vegetation and drainage management. It did not classify the entire hillside as permanently unstable, but it did recommend minimizing unnecessary disturbance. A grading sheet included the note, "Existing vegetated slope buffer, preserve where practicable." Another drainage memo assumed that natural hillside vegetation above the development would remain generally intact except for limited maintenance. Those records were more than 15 years old, and nobody on the current board seemed to have reviewed them before approving the clear cut. Aaron had, which was one reason his warning had been so specific. Then Rachel obtained the HOA's board minutes. The first meeting discussing willow removal mentioned aesthetics repeatedly, restoring view corridors, protecting premium vistas, improving homeowner enjoyment. There was almost nothing about slope stability until my report arrived. At the next meeting, one director named Peter Hall asked whether the board should delay work until an independent geotechnical opinion was obtained. Vanessa argued that doing so would create unnecessary expense and give me leverage to interfere with recorded HOA rights. The vote to proceed was 4-1, with Peter voting no. Then came the contractor email. Marcus had not only warned about my geotechnical objection, but he had also attached a recommended change order for erosion protection and temporary drainage if full removal went forward. It was not a perfect engineered stabilization plan, but it would have added controls. The board declined the extra cost. The reason noted in the approval file was that extensive slope work was outside the vegetation maintenance budget. That sentence became painful after the slide. They had treated the trees as a landscaping expense, but the hillside did not. County investigators measured rainfall totals. The storm was heavy, but not beyond anything the region had seen before. That did not mean the slide would certainly have happened with the willows still present, nor could anyone prove the trees alone would have stopped it. The technical conclusion was more careful. Removal of mature vegetation and associated surface disturbance reduced shallow soil reinforcement, altered evapotranspiration conditions, exposed portions of the slope to increased saturation and erosion, and materially contributed to susceptibility during the rainfall event. That phrasing mattered. The storm triggered the movement, but the clearing helped create worse conditions for it. Vanessa's insurer retained another engineer, whose analysis disputed some percentages, but did not deny that vegetation removal had affected the slope. The fight shifted from whether the trees mattered to how much each factor mattered, which was an insurance and liability question. Then inspectors looked at Vanessa's retaining wall. The wall itself had not initiated the slide, but it had not been designed to absorb a moving mass of saturated hillside, and the debris overwhelmed it. The villa's lower section was red-tagged pending structural evaluation, while the main upper portion remained inaccessible because the slope behind it was still unstable. Vanessa could not move furniture back in, could not finish landscaping, and could not reopen the pool. Her perfect western view now contained monitoring instruments, erosion blankets, temporary drains, and a damaged retaining system. And every expert arriving at that property received the same timeline: geotechnical warning, contractor warning, authorization to proceed, tree removal, rain, slope failure. 10 days. The easement question became the legal center of the dispute. Summit Ridge continued arguing that it possessed legitimate vegetation management rights. Rachel did not deny the recorded easement existed. That would have been pointless. Instead, she focused on scope. The easement allowed access for view maintenance, referencing trimming, selective management, and hazardous vegetation. It did not say Summit Ridge could substantially alter slope conditions without regard for damage to the underlying property. Then she found an older document in the developer archives. During creation of the view easement, a landscape consultant had drawn several example site corridors. The willows were shown as vegetation, to be managed through crown reduction and selective thinning, not total removal. A notation said, "Maintain existing rooted slope vegetation where feasible." That made Vanessa's interpretation much harder to defend. The HOA had taken a limited view maintenance right and treated it as permission to clear the entire living buffer. Then Discovery produced one email that changed the insurance negotiations. It came from Peter Hall, the dissenting board member. 3 days before cutting began, Peter sent Vanessa and the property manager a summary of Aaron's report and asked for postponement. His message warned that if the association proceeded after receiving a stamped geotechnical concern, The board could be assuming avoidable risk. Vanessa's response said the association could not allow every neighboring owner to defeat easement rights by hiring an expert who disagreed with maintenance decisions, followed by instructions to proceed as scheduled. She had framed the engineering report as a tactic, but after the slide, that interpretation looked very different. Then Blue Ridge Tree and Land produced its contract file. Marcus had insisted on written direction after receiving Aaron's warning, and the company had also advised against stump grinding and deeper excavation without slope review. They followed the limited clearing order they were given. That did not automatically eliminate contractor liability, but it severely weakened any attempt to blame the entire event on careless tree workers. The insurers started negotiating among themselves. My damages were modest compared with Vanessa's. Lost trees, slope damage, engineering fees, temporary drainage, and loss of use across the lower portion of my property. But I had another priority. I wanted permanent stabilization, no cosmetic repair, no new decorative plantings chosen for views, but an engineered slope plan. The county required one anyway. A multidisciplinary team designed it. Surface runoff would be intercepted higher on the slope, subsurface drainage would reduce water pressure in critical areas, and the failed soil mass would be regraded where feasible. Erosion control matting would protect exposed ground. Deep-rooted native vegetation would be replanted, and selected willow species would return to the wetter bench. The villa required its own revised retaining design below. Vanessa objected to the height and density of some proposed replacement vegetation, which was almost impossible to believe. After everything that had happened, she was still thinking about the view. The county engineer ended that discussion. Stabilization would be driven by slope performance, not by the preferred sightline from the villa. For the first time since the dispute began, Vanessa no longer controlled what happened on that hillside. Physics and permit requirements did. The financial consequences grew. Emergency stabilization, geotechnical monitoring, engineering, debris removal, retaining reconstruction, building repairs, legal costs, temporary lodging and loss of use claims related to the villa, and restoration of my land. Nobody handed me a simple invoice showing exactly what Summit Ridge paid. Different carriers covered different portions, and some costs remained disputed. But the combined exposure moved well into the high six figures, possibly more once final structural work was included. And the original dispute had begun over trees the HOA could have selectively trimmed. That was the part residents could not forgive. For the next 3 months, the lower slope looked like an engineering project. Monitoring stakes, survey prisms, temporary pipes, sediment controls, and excavators, working only when the geotechnical team approved access. County inspectors visited after every major phase. Before crews rebuilt Vanessa's retaining system, drainage had to be addressed above it. Before the villa's rear wall could be repaired, the slope had to demonstrate acceptable movement rates. Before landscaping returned, the stabilization plan had to be signed off. Vanessa's lower living area remained restricted. The pool terrace stayed closed, and part of the garage required structural repair. The glamorous villa that had started the dispute became Summit Ridge's most visible construction zone. Residents could see it from the internal road, and they could also see the bare slope above it. Questions multiplied. At the next HOA meeting, Peter Hall presented the project timeline. He did not need to exaggerate. The dates were damaging enough. Caleb's first objection. Aaron's geotechnical report. Contractor request for written authorization. Peter's request to delay. Board vote. Tree removal. Weather warning. Landslide. A homeowner asked whether the HOA had ever obtained its own geotechnical review before ordering the clear cut, and the answer was no. Another asked whether the trees had been declared dangerous, not as a group. Another asked whether full removal was required by the easement, which was now disputed. Then someone asked the question that ended Vanessa's control of the room. Why had a landscaping decision been allowed to override a professional slope warning when houses sat directly below it? Vanessa argued that the board had relied on legal advice regarding easement rights. The HOA attorney later clarified that his advice had addressed access and vegetation authority. He had not certified the geotechnical safety of removing the entire row. Those were two different questions, and residents understood the distinction immediately. Having the legal right to perform some maintenance did not answer whether a specific method was technically responsible. The board suspended Vanessa's authority to approve landscaping, tree removal, or slope work. A new rule required professional engineering review for substantial vegetation removal on steep common areas or easements, and another required board members to disclose when a proposed project materially benefited their own property. That second rule was aimed directly at the villa. Vanessa had voted on work that improved her personal view, and whether or not that alone violated the governing documents, residents considered it an obvious conflict that should have been handled differently. A recall petition began the following week, and she resigned before the vote. Peter became interim president. His first decision was not dramatic. He approved the county stabilization plan exactly as the engineers recommended. No view modifications, no substitutions, no negotiation over tree height, just fix the slope. The new willow plantings went in late that fall. They were small, nothing like the old trees, but their locations followed the wet bench. Native shrubs were planted between them. Deep-rooted grasses covered disturbed areas, and temporary irrigation supported establishment. The old slope would never return exactly as it had been, as mature trees take decades, but it was finally being managed as terrain rather than scenery. The county lifted the most severe restrictions after monitoring showed the hillside had stabilized. Vanessa's villa repairs continued for several more months. When the new retaining wall was finished, it was heavier, better drained, and considerably more expensive than the original. The glass survived, and the mountain view survived too, just not in the perfectly open form Vanessa had wanted. Young trees now crossed part of it again, and this time, nobody suggested cutting them down. A year after the slide, I walked the lower bench after another week of rain. Water still moved through the slope, which had not changed and never would, but now the flow was managed. The upper interceptor drain was working. The reconstructed swale carried runoff without cutting into exposed soil, and the new vegetation held. The willow saplings were already taller than I expected. I stopped beside one of the old stumps that engineers had left in place during stabilization. Its rings were visible where the trunk had been cut, showing more than 60 years of growth. That tree had been there before the first Summit Ridge Road was graded, before Vanessa bought her lot, before anybody described the western view as an amenity. For decades, nobody paid attention to what those roots were doing below the surface. Then the trees disappeared, and 10 days later everybody wanted to understand them. That is what stayed with me. Not the resignation, not the insurance dispute, not even the image of mud piled against the villa. It was how quickly something could go from ugly vegetation to critical slope condition, once people were forced to measure its function instead of its appearance. Summit Ridge eventually reimbursed the agreed costs connected to restoration of my property, professional reports, survey work, and legal expenses through its settlement process. The hillside easement was clarified. Future maintenance would allow selective pruning, subject to arboricultural and, where necessary, geotechnical review. Wholesale removal of rooted slope vegetation was no longer treated as routine view maintenance. That was the protection I wanted from the beginning. Vanessa sold the villa the following year. I do not know whether the slide caused the decision, and I never asked. The new owner introduced himself once and told me he liked the young willows. I appreciated the irony, but did not mention it. The mountain did not need another argument. If you own land where trees, drainage, retaining walls, or steep grades affect neighboring property, save every survey, engineer report, photograph, notice, and email. And if someone insists that a technical warning is merely an obstacle to an aesthetic project, getting that warning in writing can become the most important thing you do. Tell me in the comments what you would have done when the HOA ordered 23 mature trees removed after receiving a geotechnical warning. Would you have fought harder for an emergency court order, or would you have documented every decision and let the engineers establish responsibility afterward? Share this story with anyone living in a mountain subdivision, hillside community, or HOA where landscaping decisions can affect drainage and soil stability. And if you enjoy property rights stories where evidence, engineers, county records, attorneys, and lawful process matter more than shouting or revenge, subscribe and save the video for more. I never wanted Vanessa's villa buried. That part matters. There is nothing satisfying about watching somebody's home damaged by a landslide. The satisfaction came later, when the facts could no longer be dismissed. I had warned them. Aaron had warned them. The contractor had asked for clarification. A board member had asked for delay, and old engineering records had already recommended preserving the vegetated slope. There were multiple chances to stop. Selective pruning would have protected the view. A phased plan could have protected the ground. Temporary drainage could have reduced risk. And an independent geotechnical review would have cost almost nothing compared with what followed. The board chose speed, then rain arrived. The storm did not read the easement. The hillside did not care who was president, and the soil did not know the villa had premium finishes. All it knew was water, weight, slope, and resistance. Vanessa wanted the trees gone because they stood between her glass wall and the mountains. 10 days after they disappeared, part of that mountain crossed the distance for her. And every young willow growing on that restored slope now stands as a reminder of the lesson Summit Ridge paid dearly to learn. A better view is never worth removing the very thing holding the ground in place.